Doo-doo. That's good? All right. Thank you. Yeah. A joke? No, I don't know any good jokes. Of course, there is that story about the guy in the newspaper. He was addicted to the hokey pokey, but he turned himself around. Yeah. That's a joke. All right. I'm a father, so those are the kinds of jokes that I tell. Well, today we're going to look at the sanctuary. I've done an introduction to the Torah. We've talked about the narrative. Had to move rather quickly toward the end yesterday, but I thought we got appreciably well up to the 40-year period in the wilderness. And then from that point forward, there's a lot of interesting narrative there in the book of Numbers, and just kind of outlined what those stories were, but didn't go into them at greater depth. But we want to move forward, and our time is limited, so today I want to talk more specifically about the sanctuary and the rituals that go on in the sanctuary. This is really the center of ancient Israel's religious life. The book of Leviticus is the central book of the Torah, and there's very little narrative in it. So as we've been saying all along, God's kingship is established in creation, but in order to redeem the kingship, he has to redeem man as his image. So we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow when we talk about the law. And he also needs to redeem the world as his sanctuary. The purpose of the world is that God will come and dwell in it, that it will be a sanctuary or a house for his presence. And Ziva? Oh.
Can we just get more batteries?
More batteries. I'll project in the meantime. Or do you want me to wait?
Oh, it's on that end.
That's okay. I'm going to run out fast. And they're really, really bad, so. That's probably the best one I got right there. Oh, that's it. Okay. So the sanctuary is a place and a time indwelt by God's presence. So we're going to use the word sanctuary because there's going to be a number of different kinds of things that serve as sanctuaries throughout the Bible. But in the Bible, we have a creational sanctuary in the Garden of Eden. So the first time we encounter sanctuary is in the Garden of Eden. That is often missed because when we read about Adam and Eve in the garden, we tend to sort of envisage quite literally the things being described in the text. But if you look at this tabernacle, you'll find that a lot of the elements that are here in the tabernacle appear there in the garden. So for example, the garden has a large river, and we see that the tabernacle has a laver or a basin filled with water. The Garden of Eden also has the gift of food. Likewise, the tabernacle here has a table with food set out on it. There is the tree of life in the garden, and likewise in the tabernacle we have the menorah, which is fashioned after the shape of a tree. And finally, there is God's presence in the garden, just as it is there in the most holy place. And maybe most notably, on this veil, there are embroidered cherubim, marking the place where you enter into God's presence. And we also find the cherubim in the garden, right? So, and then there is God's fiery presence. So the Garden of Eden is the first sanctuary in the Bible, and so I call it a creational sanctuary. Then we have two covenantal sanctuaries. One in the time of Moses, which moves from Sinai to the tabernacle. And then later, a Christian one, which moves from Christ into the church. Sinai is really a also, well, just to go back to the Garden of Eden sanctuary, you remember after the man and the woman, they're in the garden, they're sent east of the garden, right? So when the man and the woman are sent east of the garden, that places them in the outer court. And therefore, in the book of Genesis, that's the first time we find Cain and Abel bringing sacrifices to the Lord. That's an indication that they are now in the outer court. Then, when Cain murders his brother Abel, he's sent east again. And that's an indication that he now occupies outside the sanctuary. So the geography of the Garden of Eden is divided into 3 parts. Same as the sanctuary is divided into 3 parts. We also find the same thing to be true of Mount Sinai. That's my picture of Mount Sinai. If you read the book of Exodus very, very closely, you'll see that Moses builds an altar in front of the mountain. And then he also puts barriers around the mountain so that people cannot get too close. Moses is the only one who actually enters into God's presence in the cloud, which is the equivalent of the most holy place. The elders and the priests are actually able to go onto the mountain where they have their covenant meal. That would be the equivalent of the holy place. But the altar where the people meet is in the outer court. So we find that same threefold division of space there on Mount Sinai. So just kind of laying out some patterns here for how this sanctuary works. Jesus of Nazareth will specifically identify himself with the sanctuary. Particularly in the Gospel of John, he says, "Destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it again in 3 days." Right? Well, we know he's not talking about the building that he's standing in front of. Actually, the writer, just in case we missed it, tells us Jesus was talking about his own body. And Jesus will say a number of other different kinds of things to identify himself with the sanctuary. For example, he will say that he is the sacrificial lamb that would be placed on the altar. He will say that he is the water, or he is the stream of living water. He will say that he is the light of the world, referring to the menorah. He will say that he is the bread that came down from heaven, referring to the bread laid out on the table. Or he will say that he and the Father are one. Now, did you talk much about the tabernacle from the previous week? No. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about that. I'm going to provide a map of the sanctuary. So that may mean you didn't catch everything that I just said, but this is a bird's eye view of my tabernacle here. We've got the most holy place here. And that is behind this purple squiggly is the veil. And then we have a holy place. And then we have an outer court. So the tabernacle is divided into 3 parts. 1, 2, 3. Now, all of this is open air because they're going to be sacrificing animals there on the bronze altar. So you can't have it enclosed unless you want to smoke everybody out. So this is all open air, but this part here that I will put in purple is an enclosed tent. And throughout Exodus, that is often referred to as the tent of meeting. So it's extremely dark in there, which is why you've got to have the menorah. People say, oh, why is the menorah in there? There must be some deep meaning. Well, no, it's light. Otherwise, the priests are going to fall over and bounce into things. It's actually quite dark in here. So I mentioned earlier that this is going to face to the east. So if I'm wanting to come and sacrifice, I'll enter in through the west. This square here is a bronze altar with a little fire on it, and that's where I'll be doing my sacrifice. Behind it is a basin of water, which will be used for washing. So we have 2 pieces of furniture in the outer court. A bronze altar for doing sacrifice, and then a basin, also of bronze, filled with water for washing. Now, as we move into the holy area of the temple or the tabernacle, they'll stop using bronze and they'll move on to gold. So as we move into the more holy part of the tabernacle, more precious materials are used. And there's, in the holy place, that's where, so the outer court is where the people go. If you're an Israelite, you don't go past the outer court. The priests, however, officiate between the holy place and the outer court. So they'll do the sacrifices, but then they're allowed to go into this tent, and there are 3 pieces of furniture there. There are a table in the north made out of gold with 12 loaves of bread, which are set out every Sabbath day. The bread is for the priests to eat, and they eat it on the Sabbath. To the south, there is the menorah, which is a gold lampstand shaped like a tree, and that is lit, and that provides light within the holy place. And then, just to the west, right in front of this curtain, is a golden altar, and they're going to burn incense on that altar. They do not slaughter animals, but that incense goes up on the altar. Then there is a veil so that you cannot see into the most holy place, embroidered with cherubim, which are guardian entities that tell you not to come further. Now, sometimes in those old movies they have big lions standing in front as if to say, don't go past this door. The cherubim sort of serve that function. And then in the most holy place, just one piece of furniture. That is the Ark of the Covenant, in which the 10 Commandments are put, and over which the presence of Jehovah rests. Okay, so we got 3 divisions of holiness. God's presence is here, so as you move out from that, you're moving into less and less holy space. As you move into that, you're moving into more holy space, and as a result, the requirements and the restrictions become greater and greater and greater the closer you get. In fact, only one person is allowed in the most holy place once a year, and that is who? The high priest. So we know that. Nadab and Abihu on the first day of worship got too close. And that's not the last time that sort of thing is going to happen. So I've got this written down up here. And over here, I've written about the furnishings. Shekinah is an old Hebrew word referring to the fiery indwelling presence of Jehovah. So this is the Shekinah. It is lethal to its opposite, and so anything bearing sin or impurity will be consumed by the Shekinah. It's fun to say that word. Right in front of it is an embroidered veil. This is the veil that the New Testament writers say was torn from top to bottom in the death of Jesus. So that's very, very important. And that embroidered veil has pictures of cherubim on it. Cherubim are known outside the Bible as mythic creatures. You want to know what one looks like. How many of you know what a sphinx looks like? Okay, they're depicted a lot in ancient art with the body of a lion, the head of a human, and the wings of an eagle. Cherubim in ancient art generally are used as guardians of holy places. They're not to... basically, to see a cherub is to see... It's like seeing a sign that says no trespassing. At least if you value your life, you won't go past this. So we have a veil, and then 3 divisions of the sanctuary I mentioned, and then 7 furnishings overall. So the numbers 3 and 7 occur quite a bit in the sanctuary. 3 divisions, 7 pieces of furniture. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The veil counts as 6, and the Ark of the Covenant is 7. Now in a little bit, I'm going to talk about these words up here, but before I do, Any of you have any questions about this tabernacle? There are maps of it, I would assume, in your Bible or your study guides if you want to have a nice, tidy-looking map of it. The temple that Solomon will later be built is this exact pattern. This pattern was shown to Moses on his second trip up the mountain where he stayed for 40 days. Yes?
What do the incense represent? Like what part of God? Like what would like be the New Testament version of that today?
Good question. Most passages in the Old Testament talk about incense on analogy to prayer. So incense, obviously, we all know it gives a nice aroma. But what it's doing is by having incense continually burning in front of the veil, that the face of the deity is continually drawn toward the worshiper. It's a perpetual supplication, a symbol of perpetual prayer. So obviously people can't be always in prayer unless, at least in the sense of constantly verbalizing prayer. There may be other ways to maintain an atmosphere of prayer. But these things are to provide continual supplication to Jehovah. So the incense altar is a continual prayer. The bread and the light are for the priests. And the idea is that Jehovah provides light to his priests and he feeds them. He provides them with food. And this is the holiest food in the nation of Israel. It's holy because it's there in God's presence. And so it's special for the priests. They eat it on behalf of the whole nation of Israel. One of the rules, we'll talk about it later when we get to the food laws, but if you could get this through your head, it'll make a lot of sense out of a lot of parts of the Bible. The closer you get to Jehovah, the more you take your food exclusively from him. Okay? The more he becomes the sole source of life that sustains you. So, as we move further away from Jehovah, we have fewer laws about food because we can eat whatever we want. Now, to us that sounds like an advantage. Oh, more food is better, right? I had a lot of impure food yesterday at the restaurant. Very, very tasty. But as you move closer and closer to Jehovah, you go on a much more narrow diet until you get to such a narrow diet that you receive all of your food solely from him. The priests who live in this sanctuary don't eat anything that doesn't come from the sanctuary. And so the idea is that Jehovah sustains their life. So we'll talk about that when we get to the food laws because we want to understand the reasons for the food laws. The reasons for the food laws are not obvious to your average reader. They just sound kind of like odd food laws. But what they're doing functionally is they're tying people's life to the temple. A Jew could not get very far away from this temple and still observe those food laws. He has to stay very, very close. Other questions about the tabernacle here? Yes? Yep. So back in Exodus, during the golden calf episode, they built the tabernacle and said, okay, come on in. And Jehovah says, no way. And so Moses, in order to speak with Jehovah, has to pitch a tent outside the camp where he will meet with Jehovah because Jehovah refuses to enter the camp because of the golden calf episode. So the phrase tent of meeting will sometimes be used in parts of the Bible to refer to something other than this. Is that your question? Yeah. Okay.
And also, like, there was a part that talked about how people were in front of their tents, and when he would go into the tent, everybody would, what would they do, like, bow down? So there was, like, this moment where everybody was watching him go into the tent.
Yes. That's correct. So the word tent of meeting, first point, can either refer to this tent here in the tabernacle or the one that Moses pitched outside the camp when he had to meet with Jehovah and Jehovah would not enter the community. And second of all, when Jehovah does enter the tent, then the people bow down and shield their faces. So, a few things. Yes?
Is there only one altar for sacrifices? How do you make it work with how much they have?
At this point, there is only one altar for sacrifice. Later, in the time of Jesus, we learn from Josephus that the temple in Jerusalem had been outfitted with 4 altars. So as the nation of Israel grew, they needed to innovate. And those altars were running all day. So at this point, this is as simple as the sanctuary will ever look. However, as we move forward into Israelite and Jewish history, the temple will have to become a little more complicated and a little bit more in order to meet all of the needs of the whole nation. Does that address your question? Yeah. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that makes provision for that. So those are decisions that the Jews made in order to adapt the law to new circumstances.
I guess, what are the New Testament parallels between this tent and our relationship with God now? Is there anything we can take from this now that we can apply in our lives as how we're to approach God?
There is. There's actually a very good book that was written by a genius. This is my book. I wrote a book in answer to that question. I'll talk a little bit about it in this class, but I figured if you're interested, you can get this on Amazon or Kindle. It's available, and these days it's not hard to get. It's just called The Sanctuary of the Soul. But the idea, at least what I take from this, is that I regard the tabernacle as a map of the human soul. So the things that go on here in the time of Moses are intended, what use are they for us today? Well, if I want to know, if I have the Holy Spirit and it comes and dwells inside of me, then I am a sanctuary, right? Because that's what a sanctuary is a place in which God makes His Spirit dwell. Acts chapter 2, what comes down and dwells on the disciples? Fire. Just as the fire came down from Mount Sinai and dwelt in the tabernacle, that event is repeated in the day of Pentecost. The only unusual thing about it is, what would that ordinarily do in the Old Testament? It would destroy them, but they were not destroyed. And that has everything to do with them being protected through Jesus' sacrifice. Jesus' sacrifice opens the way for people to come in close proximity to God without being destroyed. Now, that's just the beginning, though. The question is, well, what does it mean for me to live that kind of life? In other words, what does a life lived with God indwelling look like? And we have, in the book of Leviticus, an answer to that question. This is what sanctuary life looks like. So, one thing that I will simply say is that none of these things that go on in the sanctuary are obsolete. They're just internalized. So everything that happened in the ancient temple and in the tabernacle, still going on today. There are sacrifices being performed in my life. There is the incense of prayer. There is food. There is light. There is purification. All of those are real events that are going on inside of me every single day through Christ. And the more I learn about this sanctuary, the more I can appreciate what He's doing for me in a very organized way. I like organization. So. Yeah. You do too. Okay.
Say that again. None of them are obsolete.
I don't think any of these are obsolete. I think they are internalized. So we tend to think of them as obsolete because I obviously do not obey Leviticus chapter 11 food laws. And I don't go to some building and sacrifice animals. If I did, I'd probably get arrested. Nevertheless, God passed these laws for a reason. He didn't pass them just to wipe them away and say, okay, that was great. He passed them, I believe, in order to point to the much greater reality, what would go on in the lives of Christians. So these things are still going on. But I think you had another question.
Yeah, so it's a little bit off track, but is there any correlation between fasting and food laws? As we grow and get closer to God?
Fasting is a little different. Fasting is a discipline that the Bible enjoins on particular festivals, particularly Yom Kippur. And it's generally a sign, I mentioned earlier in the Bible, we have two big themes. God sustains us through food, and He sustains us through sex and offspring. So those are obvious. When I eat, I as an individual get to live. When I have intercourse and produce children, as a race, the community continues to live. Fasting and refraining from sexual relations appears frequently in the Bible as ways of devoting ourselves to the more spiritual life, that recognizing that we don't live purely through material things. And as human creatures, we're so materialistic, we could very easily spend our whole lives absorbed with food and sex. I mean, that would be so easy for us. That may be okay for the life of an animal. Animals eat, sleep, and reproduce. That's what they do. But as human creatures, in order to sever that connection and to remind ourselves that we're more than just material creatures, it is valuable to fast on certain occasions. It's valuable, even if I'm a married man, it's valuable to refrain from sex on occasions. One, it shows that we are disciplined with our passions and our desires. And two, it reminds us that true life does not come through just food and offspring. So that's what I would say about that. Yeah. Okay. So a few things that are a little bit more tricky here. The most important element in the sanctuary is Yahweh's presence. Okay, so Jehovah's present in the sanctuary. If Jehovah is not present, it's nothing more than an empty building. So it's important to understand that this is what makes this a sanctuary. If God's presence isn't there, it's just an empty building. And that'll be important because when Solomon builds the temple, Jehovah's presence will appear there in the book of Kings. The cloud will envelop the temple, and Jehovah's presence will take up its abode. However, later on in the Bible, when you get to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they will build the second temple. Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the first, and the divine presence will not show up. So that's a big deal. And that's toward the end of the Old Testament. And the prophets had always said that when the Messiah comes, or when the great day of the Lord comes, God will return to His temple. So the question is always, well, when's that going to happen? So one of the major big events in the Old Testament is whether or not God is in this temple. When you get to the book of Ezekiel, right before the Babylonians destroy the temple, God leaves. Actually, a general rule then is as long as Jehovah is present in the temple, it's invulnerable, right? Because God is the source of all life and the creator. So as long as Jehovah is present in this temple, the temple is invincible. If the temple is destroyed, therefore, it's a sign that God is no longer there. Actually, the book of Ezekiel will describe that. Why does Jehovah get up and leave the temple? Well, because of the sins of the nation. He says, okay, I'm going to have to leave. So he actually gets up and leaves and walks out of the temple. Not literally walks, but there's that idea. And that means that now the Israelites are kind of sitting ducks. The Babylonians can just roll right through them. And that's another big issue with Jesus' resurrection. In order to prove that Jesus is the true temple, he must show that he is indestructible. Because if God indwells him, he can't be destroyed. And that's why he says, if you destroy this temple, I will rebuild it again in 3 days. Connected with that, he also predicts the destruction of the old temple. And why does he do that? Because if the old temple is destroyed in Jerusalem, it's a sign to the Jews that God's presence is no longer there. Does that make sense? So keep Jesus' resurrection from the dead and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Those are two sides of the same coin. He mentions those two things pretty much in the same breath. Everything hinges on where God is at. Since God is holy, he transmits the quality of holiness to space, time, objects, even people. So when Moses meets Jehovah on Mount Sinai, Jehovah says, take the sandals off your feet because the place where you're standing is holy ground. It's holy ground because Jehovah's there. Is Mount Sinai holy today? No. Why not? Because God's not there. So everything depends on where he's at. So as soon as God dwells here, the quality of his holiness emanates out from that place. Now, what is holiness? The Hebrew word for holy is kodesh, and it's not definable, so here's a definition. What we'll try to do is come up with an organized way of talking about something that escapes our grasp. Then at least we can do something with it. But I'll say holiness is a mysterious quality. That's important because it's of the nature of holiness that it is mysterious and that it escapes our grasp. So that's fundamental to what it is. But it's a quality of Jehovah's being, his goodness, and his beauty. So the three classical definitions of things are that they exist, that they are good, that they are beautiful. God has all three of these qualities. He does exist, he is good, and he is beautiful. However, he is those things in such a way that it escapes our ordinary grasp. He exists, but he exists differently than things that we know of. He is good, but he is good differently than the things that we know of, and so on. And as a result, human beings experience humility toward themselves and awe, reverence, and fascination toward him. So in the presence of holiness, human beings are brought low and humbled, and they are, as far as their attitude toward God is, they are caught up with awe, reverence, and fascination. Now, that which lies outside the domain of the holy is the common. There are 4 terms here that make up all the rules of the tabernacle. So, holy, common, pure, and impure. Those 4 principles we need to understand because all of the rules that come up concerning the tabernacle are built around those 4 ideas. The common is that outside the realm of the holy. So, a tree is common. A rock is common. Your average ordinary Israelite or a Gentile. Israelites got a little bit of holiness. Gentiles, though, are common. Common doesn't necessarily mean bad. It just means not holy. Okay? So there's nothing inherently bad about being common. However, the common can be in one of 2 states. It may be either pure, in which it has nothing contrary to holiness, or it can be impure, in which it has something contrary to holiness. So that's going to be important because in order to enter into the sanctuary, everybody has to make sure that they are pure. They have to make sure that the things they bring in there are pure. So I can come into the sanctuary, that's fine, but I'm going into holy space, and I must now make sure that I am pure. So we'll have to talk a little bit about what purity and impurity are, and that'll be on my next board here. So we've talked a little bit about what a sanctuary is, what the different ones are that are in the Bible, what this tabernacle looks like, and what its 7 furnishings are. And these 4 very important terms. Before I say anything else, any questions? Make sure that you're with me, and am I going too fast?
That's good.
Okay. All right, good. Okay. The first important thing about holiness is that it transmits. It's catchy. And sin and impurity are the same way. So, the transmission of holiness is called sanctification. To make something holy means you take something that is common, which is not holy, and you're going to make it holy, and that is to sanctify it. Now, when something becomes sanctified, that means it is Jehovah's exclusive property. Something that's common, I can use for my own purposes. Okay? So I can go out and kill a deer and eat it. The deer doesn't belong to Jehovah in an exclusive sense, so I can kill it and eat it. However, things that are holy belong to Jehovah in an exclusive sense, and I just can't take them and use them for my own purposes. So, for example, the menorah here is holy. I can't show up to the tabernacle and say, I'm going to borrow this for the evening because I need some reading light at home. That light is for Jehovah's purpose in His sanctuary. I can't show up and just eat some of the bread off the table, say, oh, that looks tasty, I'll have some of that. So, very big division between the holy and the common. However, sanctification means turning a common thing into a holy thing. And is it Jehovah's purpose that everything in creation becomes sanctified? Yes. So in this sanctuary, one of the main purposes of the sanctuary is to begin the process of claiming everything for Jehovah. A lot of books of the prophets in the Old Testament will talk about that holiness is going to spread over the whole earth, and that everything will belong to the Lord. However, that's going to take some doing. So we begin here. For passive objects, objects are passive in the sense that they don't do anything. Divine action alone suffices, and that results in ritual sanctification. So, Jehovah can make something holy by just touching it, like Mount Sinai. If He touches Mount Sinai, it becomes holy. You also saw that in the book of Numbers, when Korah, Dathan, and Abiram brought out those censers, and the fire came out and consumed them. If you're a careful reader, the censers became holy. Did anybody catch that? The censers became holy, and so they actually hammered them and overlaid the bronze altar with them. That was back in the book of Numbers. There's other examples where Jehovah simply comes into contact with something, that thing becomes holy, and now it's no longer fit for common use. It becomes His. That's true of the tabernacle. Now, ritual sanctification is usually things that are objects. However, for persons, it's a little bit more difficult. One, Jehovah can't just come into contact with them, because if He does, He'll kill them. And two, persons are a little bit different than objects, because persons do things. And so we have another quality called moral sanctification. So we're going to keep these two ideas separate. There's two different kinds of holiness, though, in the Bible. If I'm an ancient Israelite, I'm ritually holy because I've been chosen by God to be His people. Doesn't necessarily follow that I am morally holy. No. I can be ritually holy, but I can be morally a mess. And so it's important to keep those two different things separate. And you achieve moral holiness by obedience.
Can you say that last part again?
Yeah. So for passive active persons, divine action must meet with human cooperation to add to ritual sanctity, moral sanctity. So you'll find passages in the Bible that seem to contradict each other. For example, one passage will say to the Israelites, "You are holy." And then another passage will say, "Be holy." Paul does this in the New Testament. He says, "You are saints," which is a way of saying you're holy, right? Saint means holy people. And then in the next passage, Paul will say, "So be holy." You're like, well, wait a second. You just said I was. So am I or aren't I? I can't, a little bit of logic will say, well, you can't have cake and eat it too. He means the word holy in two different senses. To be ritually holy means to be chosen by God. You've been chosen by Him to be His property. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your will and His will are cooperating with each other, that you're yet morally holy. I'll use my children as an example. There's a sense in which my youngest son belongs to me. He's mine. He's a Lewis. Okay, I gave birth to him. Well, my wife did. I helped. But that doesn't mean that he does everything that I would have him do, right? So I'm his father. Use God as an example. I'm his father in the sense that I begat him. But there's a sense in which he slips away from me on occasion as my son, right? I say, all right, sonny, this is what we're going to do, and he does something else. And in the same way, God is the father of Israel in the sense that He begat them. They are His children. And yet they are rebellious children, and so they are not yet holy in the sense that their will is in alignment with His will. And so this issue of ritual and moral holiness is very, very important. When we're dealing with physical objects, they're ritually holy. So the tabernacle is holy. It doesn't make sense to say that it's morally holy, because tabernacles are not moral or immoral. They're just objects that are there. But it is ritually holy. However, you could say of an Israelite that they are morally holy or morally sinful. And so that's an issue is that making sense? Yes. I want to drive this distinction in. This is very important well into the New Testament, because the Bible will use the word holy or sanctified in two different senses. All of you here, if you belong to Christ, are ritually holy. You've been adopted by God the Father in Jesus Christ to be His people. That doesn't necessarily mean that your moral sanctification has been brought to completion. There's still a task for you. There's still a task for me. And so we have to speak of holiness in two different kinds of ways. Yeah.
Do you think that's where people take Scripture and build like strong theologies on Calvinism, Arminianism, and all this stuff of like, you're chosen and predestined, but then you're also still running the race and working out your salvation?
Calvinism and Arminianism tend to emphasize different aspects of this. So I definitely see the Calvinist-Arminianist debate arising out of the tension between these two things. Calvinism really strongly emphasizes God's activity in choosing me and making me His. Arminianism emphasizes our activity in bringing ourselves into alignment with His purpose. Obviously, both of them have a point. Both of those things are quite necessary. I cannot belong to God solely through my own effort. I mean, He has to do the choosing. But neither is His election of me the only, part of the story that's important. And Calvinists and Arminianists generally find ways of hashing that debate out. But that's a good observation. You could think of ritual sanctification as sort of the Calvinist branch, This is what God does to choose you, to make you His, and moral sanctification as the Arminian, Wesleyan, Methodist side of things. We're trying to... I'm not going to try to solve that debate today, but you need to know what these two things are, because the book of Leviticus is going to come back to them again and again and again, and Paul will come back to them again and again and again. Now, having said that, let's talk a little bit about each of these, and then we may need a break. Ritual sanctification happens either by direct contact with Jehovah. We've seen that. If he touches something, it becomes holy. Actually, Nadab and Abihu, who died, they were on the fast track to holiness. And you shouldn't assume that just because somebody dies in the Old Testament that they're damned. Okay? Nadab and Abihu, when they ran into the sanctuary, they got zapped. They're physically dead. It's not necessarily a sign that they were damned, right? They went into the sanctuary with good intention. They're physically dead. The Bible doesn't really weigh in on who is saved and who isn't saved. So that's the issue that I'm opening up. That'll be important because, as you're seeing, a lot of people are dying. Okay? When they're in close proximity to Jehovah, he's very dangerous to them. To say that the divine presence flared up and that so-and-so died is not necessarily to weigh in on their salvation. That's an issue that Christians become concerned about much later on in the Bible. In the Old Testament at this point, it's not really dealt with. They got holy real quick. But at any rate, direct contact, I mentioned the ground at Sinai, the tabernacle's made holy, and Moses is the only person to get a little bit of this and survive. We talked about Moses. Or the altar. We mentioned that the altar is doused with blood, so everything that comes into contact with it becomes holy. If I put a lamb on the altar, the lamb becomes holy. If I make lamb chops, those are holy lamb chops, and I can't just take them out of the sanctuary and pack them in my freezer. Even the ashes are holy and have to be dumped in a pure, holy place. So you can even have holy garbage. The point is that you've encountered several verses in Leviticus that say it has to be taken to a pure place and dumped. So there's going to be a place outside the sanctuary for dumping holy things, and there's going to be a place outside the sanctuary for dumping impure things. Those are going to be kept separate from each other. Sounds kind of odd. Judas Iscariot bought an impurity dumpster in the book of Acts called the Potter's Field. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And he dumped himself off in that field. You can also make things holy by consecrating them, so you declare something as Jehovah's property and you set it apart for that purpose. So that's when it can't come into direct contact. Now, you can consecrate things temporarily or permanently. So if I want to give something to the sanctuary on a temporary basis, I could give an animal, I could give a field, I could give a house, I could even give myself to the sanctuary as a temporary measure, in which case I'm called a Nazirite. So a person who takes a Nazirite vow in Numbers chapter 6 basically says, I'm devoting myself to the sanctuary for a period of time, and I'm vowing to serve God in a particular capacity. Then after that time, I'll return to normal status. 3 things the Nazirite needs to do is grow out their hair, abstain from any kind of fermented drink, and stay away from corpses. We'll talk a little bit about why that is, but the hair growing out is so that you can visually pick them out and know that they are holy. The Apostle Paul takes a Nazirite vow in the New Testament and grows his hair out, and he actually returns to Jerusalem at the completion of his vow. When his vow's done, he will cut off his hair and put it on the altar. And that's how he knows that his vow is complete. He'll shave his hair, and he'll put it on the sacrificial altar. You can also be a permanent Nazirite. So you can give things to the sanctuary permanently. I could give my field permanently to the sanctuary, and they can grow crops on it. I can give my house. I can give an animal. Famous permanent Nazirites were Samuel. He'll be a Nazirite for life. Samson, everybody's heard of him. John the Baptist was a lifelong Nazirite. These guys never cut their hair. So they were very hairy people. We'll talk a little bit about moral sanctification. I'll just mention a few things and then we'll have our break. This is all ritual sanctification. All it means is that I am God's property, or this lamb is God's property, or this field is God's property. Moral sanctification is done by the things that the Bible mentions. Fear and love the Lord. That's Moses' most basic commandment. If you want to be morally holy, you must fear God and love Him. What else? Be humble toward yourself. Well, that goes with fearing the Lord. Trusting in His promises, being obedient to His commands. Those are the main things that make up moral holiness throughout the Torah. Humility, fear and love of God, trusting in His promises, being obedient to His commands. Simple. 4 simple things. It's a lot, actually.
What would you say is one thing that we can learn from the Israelites, from the way that they feared the Lord? Like, I feel like they feared the Lord a lot more than any of us, or most Christians do nowadays. Or like, I don't know, they have more reverence for it. It seems like.
Well, the Israelites didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. If they got too close, they died. So you would learn to fear pretty quickly. And I think from a Christian point of view, you're quite right that we can take for granted the special fellowship that we have with God through Christ, easily taken for granted, so that we cease to stand in awe of Him or reverence Him, and we almost treat Him like a buddy, where He's not a buddy. So I think probably maybe one of the things to learn is to learn that God is holy, that we are sinners, that we enter into His presence with awe and reverence and caution. Boldly, as the Bible says, with confidence, but that confidence doesn't come from us. It comes from what Jesus did on the cross. So I think standing in awe of the cross is maybe very, very important. We can't ever forget the cross, because the cross is the only thing that enables us to enter into God's presence. So if at whatever point we no longer think that we need the cross, then I think we've lost a sense of the holiness of God. So maybe that's the answer to your question. The reverence that the Israelites feel toward this is the same reverence that Christians have toward the cross, because it's through the cross that we're actually brought into God's presence. So I'll stay and answer other questions, but I got to let you go for your break, because it's 10:30. So.